So thanks again for joining. I'm Srinivasan, co-founder and CEO of atSpoke. And today I'm with Chad Kalmes, the VP of Technology and Risk at PagerDuty. And we're going to have a chat about how Chad and his team at PagerDuty have harnessed the power of the modern SaaS ecosystem to deliver an incredible experience for their colleagues over at PagerDuty. If you can, please join our conversation on Twitter with the hashtag CIO chat. So just to set a little bit of context about atSpoke, we've been building atSpoke for the last 4 to 5 years. And what we have created is a modern workplace service desk. We've built a ticketing system, an internal ticketing system for today's workplace. And we help our customers scale their internal employee services by providing a service desk that adapts to today's needs. It's easy to use on Slack. It uses machine learning to automate repetitive requests, and it stitches together your fragmented SaaS ecosystem. And as you can see, we have some incredible customers, including Chad and his team at PagerDuty. And the one thing that I will say that is common to all of our customers is this: they are extremely successful organizations where the internal IT teams are both forward-thinking and care deeply about customer experience. And that is sort of the common characteristic of everyone that we serve. And so we're super excited to have Chad here to share some of his learnings in terms of how he has evolved over his career and how he brings his unique mindset to the team at PagerDuty. So Chad, thank you again for joining. Would you mind telling the audience a little bit about yourself, your journey to date, and PagerDuty?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks again, Jay, for having me here today. Looking forward to our conversation. In terms of my career journey, I was maybe a little bit non-traditional in how I initially got started in technology. My first almost a decade of work was actually in professional services. And so rather than going to work just for one company, sort of primarily, I got thrown into a consulting role where it was actually kind of cool, even going back to my internship. I was already sort of interfacing with C-level executives at Fortune 100 companies and trying to help them solve problems. And I liked that exposure at the early part of my career, because one of the things that it taught me very quickly is there were a lot of very different ways to get things done. There was no sort of one size fits all rule. And seeing that in a sort of a consulting environment where you get exposure to different industries and different companies at different sizes really was kind of an eye opener for me. And then a little bit later on, when I was in the Bay Area working for a lot of tech companies, I finally sort of found that fit where I made the jump from consulting to one of my customers because I knew the team and I knew the product and I was really excited to get my hands dirty. That kind of then started my journey within IT management and technology management to really practice what I'd preached for years. It's one thing to kind of parachute into an organization, get to know them really quickly, make some recommendations, and then kind of leave. Once I moved into industry myself, it was kind of, I had to put my money where my mouth was, so to speak, and really put into place a lot of those processes, systems, sort of approaches that I'd been talking about. And then through my journey in the technology sort of companies here in the Bay Area locally, I've again worked for some very, very small startups, very much at that early phase, just do everything as quickly as possible, kind of flying by the seat of your pants to make your business work, up to larger, more established companies. My last couple, both Twilio and PagerDuty, I actually helped through the IPO process. So they were at obviously a later stage in their growth. The IPO is just one milestone among many. But it was really great to see, again, all those different companies at all those different sort of stages of growth and maturity, and get to make your impact and your sort of presence felt across those organizations. And at PagerDuty, I started when the company was probably a little over 200, maybe 300-ish employees, and we're closing in probably on about 1,000 now. So again, seeing that very rapid growth and scale in an organization over the course of 2 or 3 years, to me is exciting. That's really a great time to be at an organization and be there to kind of set some of those foundational strategies and technologies in place that hopefully help that company grow for the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, going through Twilio's IPO process and then doing the same thing at PagerDuty, I think puts you in very rarefied air. There's a very few people that can claim to have been at these types of organizations in your role at such pivotal times. So that's incredible. One thing that you did say, I was a consultant in my past as well. And the exact reason I moved into tech and initially in product management and then eventually to being a CEO was the exact same reason, where it's one thing to consult, it's another thing to just go do it yourself. And so getting your hands dirty was, I think, is a big part of why a lot of us enter this industry. So for today's conversation, we're going to talk about the impact of digital transformation, but just to set the stage, everyone. Everyone uses the word digital transformation. It is the du jour right now, especially with shelter in place. But the fact is, it is and it's happening. Over the last year, in particular, as companies have been forced to think about going remote, there's been this incredible push in organizations to update the way they think about IT, the way they think about internal support. And the fact is, this actually delivers results. These are some stats that we pulled from a recent report. But the bare bones truth is, digital transformation is good because it has an impact on improving operational efficiency. It gets companies to get their products to market faster, and it improves their ability to serve customers. So digital transformation obviously has an incredibly positive side to it. But the conversation that we're really going to have today is about the other side of it, which is the sort of some of the downsides of digital transformation, or some of the aspects of digital transformation that you need to manage for. And specifically, what we're going to talk about is SaaS sprawl. So I've shared this slide in different formats a bunch of times recently, but it's fascinating to me how there's been this complete explosion in the number of SaaS tools that are being used by any organization right now. At latest count, it's in the hundreds for most organizations. And the impact of this, the impact of SaaS sprawl, the impact of the Cambrian explosion in SaaS apps is workers spend more time looking for the right answer, and a lot of times they don't even know where to go. And so that's where we're going to be spending most of our time today, Chad. But just starting on this, and as you think about your role in IT, can you talk about how you view SaaS sprawl? How have you seen it evolve over the last several years, and how has your perspective on IT's role changed as a result of that?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, it's obviously something we'll probably pick apart from a number of different perspectives today. But yeah, I mean, I think there are both pros and cons to call it the SaaS sprawl that is there today. One of the biggest pros, obviously, is that they're just a wealth of really great solutions out there, probably a bespoke solution to any individual problem you could possibly think of. And some of those tools, even if it's coming from, a 5-person startup working out of their garage, may be best in class compared to what is offered by some of the traditional, call it legacy players, the SAPs, the Oracles, the Microsofts of the world. And so now whereas in the past, IT largely sort of had to consume these bigger enterprise, there were very few players in the space and very few options. You maybe had 2 or 3 to kind of pick from. Now you've got, tens, maybe even dozens of solutions in any one particular space. And so that choice is great because it can be very empowering. But on the flip side, that can also be daunting. How do I actually find what is going to be the best fit for me, and how do I make use of all of these different tools? And again, in the past, when you had very few options and there were sort of these, I don't want to say monolithic, but really large sort of all-encompassing type providers, they generally had a little bit of everything to choose from, and you just kind of went with what that default option was. Now in the sort of the SaaS ecosystem, and we'll probably again touch on this later, really the API ecosystem on top of that, you can start to pull in aspects of some of those different tools and seamlessly kind of weave them together to create the experience that you want. And I think that's ultimately really the power of all of these SaaS applications, bringing them together to create your own experience. And I like to think of this environment as, kind of a box of Legos where, yeah, you can pull the directions that come with the set and build it exactly the way that the manufacturer says you can, or you can take a step back and say, well, maybe I want my own Starship or my own Hogwarts, or, I want to make it my own way. I can take those individual pieces that the different software applications provide and put them together in a way that's truly unique for my environment. That's really the best of both worlds. You get the power of some of these larger providers and larger platforms that have been around for a while that have really deep and great functionality in some areas. And then you've got some of these SaaS solutions that are more specialized and focused in very particular problems. And if you can bring those two worlds together and create an experience that actually maps to what your business is trying to accomplish and the processes that you're trying to enable, that's really the power of software. That's where SaaS has its big bang.
No, for sure. And as you sort of think about how you have, the phrase you'd used when we had chatted in the past was this balancing act of being a central authority, dictating who uses what, and empowering everyone to use whatever they want. As you sort of balance these two, any tactical advice to the IT audience that's watching today, in terms of when you draw the line, or what are the boundaries that you set? How do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it comes down to first and foremost understanding your business and your strategic objectives. What is it that the company is really trying to accomplish? And then making sure that you've got a roadmap to support that strategy and that agenda. And ultimately, you need to start with that sort of end in mind. Like, what are the processes I'm trying to enable, or maybe even, quite frankly, improve or sort of standardize for the first time, and make sure that you're very clear in that direction and that understanding of what the business is trying to accomplish before you start to even call it layer in or factor in the software side of things. I think where people tend to go wrong in some of this digital journey is they start with the software or the solution because they see something that they think is really cool and exciting, and it might be, but if you don't start with that end in mind, you may make a decision very early on that actually kind of puts you off on the wrong direction, and then it might be hard to kind of undo that. So I think while we're all charged with moving quickly and trying to be agile and innovative, I think pausing at the start of that journey to make sure you're very clear on where you're going is the very first and most important step that you can take. If you get that part right and you have a very clear understanding of what it is you're trying to accomplish, how that factors into the success of your business, making those subsequent decisions gets a lot easier, and you can sort of cut through some of the noise that might be out there to really focus on that solution that's going to be the best for your particular implementation.
That makes sense. So at the end of the day, make sure that you have a core goal that you're marching towards, and then fit the solutions to that versus using every tool just because it looks cool.
Exactly.
One thing that we are everyone's been talking about recently, of course, is Slack getting acquired by Salesforce, and there have been two interpretations of this. One, which is frankly a little bit less charitable, is guess what? User experience doesn't matter. Everyone loves Slack because from a user experience perspective, it was quite refreshing. End users benefited from it. But at the end of the day, the person writing the check makes the calls, and they don't care about user experience, they care about dollars. So that's one view. The other view is actually stitching together. There's so much SaaS sprawl now that stitching it together makes sense. There's going to be some consolidation. So what is your take on those two statements?
Yeah, again, I think this is a great example of that balancing act, obviously at a macro level of, that sort of core traditional enterprise platform that has, a large chunk of your business invested in it. In this case, the sort of the sales CRM aspect of your organization, but realizing that's not just a point solution. And I think if you look at what Salesforce has done over time, not only have they built a phenomenal core platform, just around that sort of CRM experience, but they're thinking through, like, how do I continue to speak to those other buyers in an organization to really meet business needs more broadly. And I think Slack is a really interesting acquisition for them. One, if you look at it from the Slack perspective, they get sort of a, call it, step function in their authority to operate in really large organizations with now Salesforce behind them. I think they already had an extremely competitive, really innovative product that was going to be successful one way or another. But now when you partner that with, call it the air cover of the Salesforce brand, I think it immediately opens up doors, to larger enterprises and other customers who may have been wary of this, new startup coming into their organization and being part of so many of their critical processes. And from the Salesforce standpoint, I think even going back a couple of years, again, they're looking at how do they take the power of their core platform and extend that into other use cases. And I think they've been very smart in acquiring companies. And I think MuleSoft is another great example of this, where they look at the power of the API ecosystem that they're building, and they realize that they can acquire and integrate a lot of different companies, but still leave them standalone. So it's not the traditional sort of one size fits all approach. They just have a larger menu of options that they can now offer, that if you just want standalone Slack, you can get that. But there's also power of, how they integrate these into that bigger picture. And so as your organization grows and becomes, maybe larger and more enterprise in its approach, there's a natural sort of evolution within now the Salesforce ecosystem to start maybe with some of their smaller point solutions and keep graduating up to a more holistic, sort of Salesforce-centric approach to your business. I think, again, look at some of the other larger tech players in this space, Microsoft, Oracle, others have done this for a long time. I think Salesforce is taking a really cool approach to it, because they started out, again, as probably the first or one of the first cloud, no software, companies, and they've used that to their advantage. And again, I think as they keep evolving that API ecosystem, they know that they can offer, best in class products for companies that want those or need those at a certain scale, but they also play really well with a lot of the smaller vendors and players out there. And so you can really start to build and, sort of cobble together the solution set that works best for you. And sure, over time, I think companies are going to keep, doubling down on those larger core platform plays and ultimately investing in that traditional Salesforce product. But the more that they're able to extend that and offer layered services that all make sense as a whole, that starts to become a really compelling platform and marketplace for the future.
And how do you see and look, as a startup, I'm very grateful that we got a chance to work with you, but how do you see do you think there's going to be contraction, or do you think there's just going to continue to be this explosion of new vendors? And how does discovery even happen at your scale now? Like, when there are 8,000 new SaaS apps being created every year, how do you even discover things?
Yeah, I mean, some of that, speaking kind of from my own focus and our focus at PagerDuty, it comes back down again to staying laser focused on those core objectives and what you're trying to accomplish. Yeah. And again, yeah, there might be noise of a lot of great solutions out there, and some of those might be a great fit for what you're trying to accomplish, but you start with those kind of first principles of, like, what does the business need to accomplish? What am I trying to build here? And make sure that you've got the best approach or the best sort of solution set for those. And once you're comfortable there, then expand that bubble and that view sort of out further. And over time, I think you start to really take advantage of those, thousands of SaaS applications that might be out there. But I think that explosion or that growth of those tools has to be sort of intentional and managed. And that's not to say that you don't, that you lock down your rules so quickly that users can't self-discover and use some of those tools, because I am very much a fan of users being empowered to sort of understand what works best for them and highlight and surface some of those solutions, because, quite frankly, my teams can't be aware of every possible solution that's out there. And so leveraging your user base to pre-filter or even trial some of those things, as long as you're doing that securely and sort of with a mindset to how that would fit into your overall organization, I think that's a great way to kind of trial some of those things. And then as you start to hear from users, hey, the current solutions we have might not be a great fit. I'm actually seeing this over here that might be a better fit. That allows you to sort of keep an open mind and keep your head up, and kind of taking that step back on occasion to say, hey, just because we made a decision 12, 18 months ago, a couple of years ago, that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the best for us. And how do you sort of work that into your evolution as a company, that you're constantly sort of churning through what's working well, what's not working well, how do we improve that experience? Does that mean we actually need new tools, different tools, more functionality? It's a constant dialogue. And I think your users have to be part of that conversation. And I think they're very valuable part of that conversation, because again, there's a lot more of them typically than there are of the IT team. And so, leveraging all those eyes and ears to your advantage is very, very helpful.
No, that makes absolute sense. And I guess the last question on this topic, and I go back to sort of one of the theses around Slack and Salesforce versus Microsoft Teams, the role of user experience. So how do you, in your decision making at PagerDuty, at Twilio, and in your past, what is the value given to end user experience? Is it a must-have? Is it a nice-to-have? Is it something that you try to prioritize when you can, but it could fall by the wayside? How do you think about that?
No, I think user experience is probably, if not tied for first with sort of those business objectives, it's a close second. I think especially in today's world with a lot of the, sort of consumerization of enterprise technology, people see that there's a lot of value and benefit to getting that user experience right. I think through the old, green screens that were the user interface for mainframe applications, or the very first, call it web-based interfaces, the GUIs and the UIs. They weren't friendly, but they were better than anything else that existed at the time to get your work done. Now that there's so much software out there, elevating that user experience and just thinking about how people actually interact with the service and the software, that can become, a top level priority. And I think it's important to factor that in. A lot of times we get distracted with, the, one sort of shiny feature that makes something, a platform seem way cooler or better, more innovative than something else. But if that's, a feature that 10% of your users might interact with on a monthly basis, I don't value that nearly as highly as just, what is that core experience like for the people that are going to live in this system 6-7 hours a day, every day of the week. That's got to be really good, because if that's, detrimental to people getting their work done, or if it's not intuitive and user friendly, that's going to be a massive drain on the organization as a whole. And so I think focusing on that core experience and making sure that, call it that 80% is handled really well and really maps to what your users are trying to do, that's got to be kind of one of your first decision points. After that, sure, other features and things are great, but that user experience has to be rock solid.
No, I love hearing that, and that, as I said, I think that is a common characteristic of almost all atSpoke customers. So I'm glad to hear you say that. Let's sort of shift gears now. Talk about remote work, and as we were talking about this previously, I think there are two things that I'd love for you to tease out here. One, just like everybody else, I'd be curious to understand how PagerDuty went through going remote. What was the how did you folks approach it? What worked? What didn't? What did you learn? And then two, I want to talk about what's going to return to normal versus what is now, this is the new way of working. So why don't we start with the first one? How was your transition to shelter in place?
Yeah, I would say that we were, among the luckier companies when it came to making that very quick, sort of unplanned shift to remote work very early on. Our sort of design philosophy and approach had, for a very, long period of time, been based on sort of call it the zero trust principle for security and authentication. And as we built out our environments, we never actually tied any of our services or support or even sort of our macro security controls to any particular office location. We always sort of approach things with a very cloud first, zero trust, location agnostic approach. And so when we made the shift to pure work from home, I'd say 99% of our processes and systems largely did not have to change. The ones that did have to change were those called the handoffs between the digital world and the physical world. And most notably, you think about onboarding employees, their first experience used to be, you'd show up in the office and you'd meet your start class, so to speak, and you'd get your physical hardware and have a bunch of orientation sessions. And that was one of those areas that very quickly on we had to rethink, both in terms of, how do we just do the sort of the social aspects of that, do trainings and things like that virtually and translate some of that content from an in-person experience to remote. But on, again, call it the hardware and software delivery side, we'd always focused in the past on, well, we'll just ship a bunch of laptops to our offices where people start and we'll configure them there and just kind of deal with some of that stuff. When we kind of moved to a zero touch approach, it was okay. How do we work with our vendors to get that stuff drop shipped directly from a warehouse to an employee at their home address and do that quickly and efficiently? And how do we make that out of the box experience for that laptop work that, they literally just turn it on, make sure they're on the internet. It does any configuration setup for them without having to be touched by anyone, so that was, kind of call it the last mile that we really had not yet fully digitized. But I think when we made the shift to pure work from home, it probably took us 2 to 3 weeks of just, okay, let's just focus on this. Let's get it across that line. We knew we had to do this at some point. Now this is a forcing function. So very quickly, those last few experiences that hadn't really been thought through from again, purely digital or remote standpoint, we were able to make those kind of last couple of changes and get that experience really dialed in pretty quickly.
Yeah, and so what I'm hearing is the digital only transition fine. And fortunately most things were digital, and it's the digital and physical interface, which is where you basically just focused on it the first few weeks after the transition happened, and that stabilized as well. Let's play this forward. So sometime in 2021, let's say we're back in the office, or at least transition to some form of hybrid approach where there's more time in the office than currently. What's going to go back, and not just well, certainly for PagerDuty, what's going to go back to the way things were versus what things are going to stay? And would love to get your opinion on both at PagerDuty, but as a broader industry.
Yeah, speaking from PagerDuty's perspective, I'm hoping when we can actually safely make that shift back to in-office work, that we don't lose, some of the benefits that we've actually encountered by this sort of forcing function of working remote. And again, I think one of the things that we've noticed as an organization, I think a lot of companies have maybe noticed as an organization, that, having everyone, well, it's not a great experience for all people, but sort of forcing everyone through the lens of Zoom or whatever your video conferencing app might be, puts everyone on a much more even footing. And if we even think back, to our mode of operating just prior to COVID, everybody was already on Zoom meetings in general, but the folks that were sort of in the in-office experience with the nicer video conferencing setup and the face-to-face interaction, their experience on a video conference was much different than the people that were purely remote. And I think we, going into, shelter in place and quarantine, probably did those purely remote folks a disservice because we hadn't fully optimized for that experience. Now that we've forced everyone to sort of go through that purely remote work approach, I think we've learned a lot and found like, hey, actually there's some benefits here because everybody now has a much more even opportunity or equal opportunity to discuss things, to share things, to present ideas. Everyone's coming through the same little square of real estate on your screen. And I think there's a positive aspect of that we don't want to lose. But when we can get back into the office, we have to think through, okay, how do we take advantage again of that physical space, being able to actually socialize and be around coworkers, but not lose that remote workforce again? Because I think, we found the power in being able to hire people anywhere at any time. We want to continue with that. And if anything, expand on that. And so I think that return to work for us and maybe for other companies is going to be slightly nuanced because we're going to probably rethink some of those office experiences and make sure that we're further extending those to really ensure that the purely remote participants continue to sort of be on equal footing and be equal participants in that process.
I I could not agree more with at least the perspective behind that. Any thoughts on how that's actually going to happen? Because I think we've all been on a Zoom call when other folks are in the conference room and they're just louder and there are all these side conversations. Any thoughts on how that's actually going to get implemented?
Yeah, so I think again, our focus is already turning toward, what are those technologies going to be that are going to continue to glue that physical in-room experience to the digital remote experience. And so things like maybe it's as simple as making sure that you've got virtual whiteboards available so that when someone in the office, oh, I got this idea, I've got to draw it out on the wall. Again, in the previous world, you typically wouldn't be able to see that from a remote standpoint. It would be hard to understand what was going on. And so we're already starting to look at, what are those technologies we could implement or those approaches we could take to meetings to make sure that all of those things sort of have create a level playing field wherever possible so that the remote folks can participate and be part of those conversations. Some of that is technical. It's looking for solutions that continue to bridge those two worlds seamlessly. Some of that is behavioral. It's cultural. It's making sure that when we do shift back to being in the office, that people physically in the office space operate maybe a little bit differently. We avoid some of those side conversations. And we've even discussed as a company, it doesn't make sense to keep making everyone attend, even if some people are physically in a room, still sort of force everyone through maybe the Zoom looking glass to keep some of that, sort of equal footing in place. And so we're still very early, I think, in figuring out what exactly that's going to look like. But I do think it's going to be an ongoing marriage of both, call it software, hardware solutions to bridge that digital gap and some cultural behavioral change to make sure that everyone, has an equal opportunity to participate.
No, that totally makes sense. So we're at around the halfway mark. We've already gotten a bunch of questions, and there's still a bunch of topics as well. So I'm gonna move on to the next thing. Let's spend a little bit of time on something that you've mentioned many times, and whether it's during the digital transformation and working at home or otherwise, the need for IT to be proactive. It's not just about IT is not just about delivering knowledge or services when people ask for it, but instead it needs to be proactive. Can you talk about your philosophy around proactive IT?
Yeah, in terms of being proactive, again, I think we've touched on this a little bit, but I think one of the challenges is not getting sucked into that sort of the day-to-day noise or chaos or sort of the interrupt driven stuff that can show up, but making sure that from a leadership standpoint and all of your teams find times and ways to take that kind of step back from the day-to-day to again think longer term. What does work need to look like in 6, 12, 18 months, and keeping that sort of rolling forward-looking cycle of, here's where we are today, but where do we think we need to go? And trying to set yourself again onto a path that's going to lead to success earlier versus waiting to the point where something breaks or the forcing function change happens and then you're kind of caught flat-footed. And so with all of my teams, sort of regardless of their focus, one of our big tenets is constantly thinking out to the future. What are those big rocks that we see coming in the next year and a half to maybe 3 to 5 years in the future, and starting to come up with ways to roadmap those changes and think about how our existing processes and systems need to continually evolve to meet those challenges that we see coming. So I think it's an intentional mindset of looking forward and thinking through, where's the business going to be? Where are my users going to be? What are our challenges going to be? And starting to think of solutions before their problems. And again, a lot of that comes through dialogue with your end users, keeping abreast of sort of what's top of mind for them, what's working well in the current environment, what's not working well. I'm sure there are still a lot more things that we get wrong than we get right, but we try to always be aware of those and chip away at them constantly. And so there's this notion of just continual progress. Like we're always trying to improve some aspect of how we operate. When you focus just on the operations aspect and not the improvement, that's where I think you start to lose that momentum and you start to run the risk of falling behind.
Any specific examples you can point out? And again, in your experience with PagerDuty, otherwise, for the IT audience listening to this conversation, what are some low-hanging fruit where they can move from a reactive to a proactive posture?
Yeah, and again, I'm sure we'll touch on this because it's sort of nature, sort of core to the nature of atSpoke itself. But I think one of those areas that we've really intentionally started to focus on is automation, and how do we start to enable a lot more self-service for our users as we grow. They're much closer to their daily problems and challenges, and how do we sort of skip some of the steps along the way to keep empowering users to get to the right solution or to the right change as quickly as possible. And so again, with the forcing function of being fully remote, automating a lot of our support processes was kind of step one of what I think is going to be a longer term gradual move toward broader RPA. But it was like, hey, we're more distributed now, we continue to grow the business exponentially, but how do we keep scaling a lot of our core operational functions and processes in a way that we get more efficient at that and faster at that over time versus the natural sort of company reaction of, as you get bigger, things slow down and you put more sort of structure and guardrails in place. Clearly we want to make sure that our policies and standards are being adhered to, but there's sort of a lightweight, user-friendly, quick way to do that. And then there's sort of the old school structure and approach and 20 hoops to jump through. And we want to keep indexing toward that agility and getting those solutions in the hand of our end users more and more quickly. And so I think just the fact that we've started our first steps here with atSpoke on, again, what I think is an evolution toward broader RPA is part of that journey. It's how do we do things faster and more at scale without requiring constantly hiring support headcount to make that happen.
And yeah, so let's actually use that as sort of the bridge to the next two topics, which is exactly augmenting with automation as well as integrations and stitching together SaaS. So just taking a step back. So again, atSpoke, this is a core thesis of ours, which is one, you need to stitch together all of your disparate tools. It is just not efficient for the agent, for the end user, for anyone to be switching between five different tools for each task. And so there's this thesis around stitching tools together, and then there's a thesis around automating this as well. Ticketing is clearly one area that PagerDuty is working on with atSpoke. What are some other areas within the organization where you can think about both integrations and automation as an opportunity to go look at?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. One, I think if you again take that step back, honestly, that sort of challenge and finding a solution to that was also a lot of the genesis of PagerDuty itself, where we were trying to say, hey, there's a million tools in an organization today that sort of monitor and manage and track what's going on. How do we start to create that sort of unified experience to cut through all that noise and focus on the signals that need action in real time? And so that was kind of the genesis of PagerDuty for that real time emergent work that needed a person or people to look at things in real time. And we created our platform to stitch together a lot of those tools and start to become that central nervous system for the organization. But that again was really hyper focused on that sort of real time, emergency type work that needs to be fixed as quickly as possible because it's actually a problem or going to be a problem that's going to break your organization. Outside of that, sort of call it wartime use case, there's a lot of stuff that happens in your organization that is routine, it's repeatable, there may not be a specific timeline associated with it, but it all has to get done to keep your business sort of operating. And when we started on this journey toward, again, more automation and more sort of RPA in our environment, we started to look for, like, first and foremost, where are those kind of common platforms that people already spend a lot of their time in, and for us, it was Slack. Like, everybody's always in Slack. Some teams are, much more instrumented in Slack than others, but everybody kind of lived there much more so, at least in our environment, than they did in email or on an intranet or in, a more team focused solution. So that became okay, this is the meeting place where our companies kind of gathered around. Now, how do we start to bring automation and capabilities into that environment so that users can take advantage of what we're trying to build and bring to the table without having, yet another system to log into or a new tool to get to learn, or, we didn't want to disrupt where those users were operating. And so that kind of led us, down the road to atSpoke, where we could start to bring those capabilities and, quite frankly, a lot of really great new features sort of, seamlessly or invisibly into that ecosystem and start making it better, quite frankly, without users even necessarily knowing that there was yet another tool in the background. And that for us was super powerful, because we want to create those core systems of record and communities where people are already at. Like, how do we make those better versus creating yet another silo or yet another bucket that somebody's got to interact with to get something done?
For sure. And a phrase that you use that I love is modern action system. It's, think about it in terms of actions versus the static back and forth communication. No, that totally makes sense. I'm gonna hit one more topic before we get to, again, the several questions that we've got, and that has to do with measurement. And a common theme that I have seen with almost every one of our customers is that CSAT or NPS is a primary metric in how they evaluate their team's efficacy. What is the role of CSAT and NPS? What are your other metrics? How do you measure yourself? How do you measure your team?
Yeah, I think there's, sort of the historical perspective, which still has some value in today's world. And then I think there's kind of the newer pieces of that, or the newer notion. Again, if I look back at my history in IT and much larger organizations, the mindset used to very much be, is it on time? Is it on budget? Like, those were kind of the big drivers. It was very sort of financially transaction focused. Did you do what you said you were going to do for a certain amount of money? And while I think that is, still important, you don't want to just ignore budgets and sort of planning and things like that. I think a much more important aspect is not just, how sort of cash efficient you are, but how are you really meeting the needs of the organization? And I think the only way to fully understand that is to directly sort of measure that employee NPS. And we do that every year at PagerDuty, and are moving to even more real-time measurements of that, because ultimately, yes, while the CFO or financial leadership is going to want to make sure that we're sticking to budget, really the macro challenge that we're trying to fulfill is, how do we create an environment where all of our employees can be successful at what they do day to day? And that can't necessarily be measured in a purely financial sense. We have to be very connected to, what is the end user experiencing on a day-to-day basis, and where are those rough edges that still kind of stick out and catch people and are maybe more painful than they need to be. And without that direct feedback from your employees, again, I think it's hard, or it's hard to find that signal in the noise. And so we use NPS very regularly. And again, I'm hoping to keep pushing that more to real time, to use that as a way to keep that alignment between what people are seeing day to day and what we're trying to deliver in terms of our core services and support.
That makes sense. And I think you're also right that it is it's not always been the case that NPS and CSAT was a primary metric, and it is something that is going to have to, that's still on a journey, but we are seeing more and more of it. The last question I have and is around predictions. And we've talked about RPA. Is that your top IT prediction for 2021? Do you have any other sort of thoughts in terms of how you see the IT community evolve in the next year?
Yeah, I mean, we've obviously talked a lot about RPA. To me, I view that as an aspect of what can be, again, called at a very broad level, digital operations, digital transformation, AI ops. I think RPA in particular, as you start to bring the power of intelligent software and sort of intelligent software agents into the mix, that really starts to talk to AI ops, and really that's about, eliminating those silos that can be created in your environment, and reducing redundant processes and solutions to create a more business aware experience, or a better approach to doing the things that you need to get done. And I think that trend is probably top of mind, because again, I think the shelter in place and sort of operating remotely has been a big forcing function. I think it's going to continue to be a forcing function, because we've probably had years worth of evolution in this space in the last couple of months, just because people have had to do it. I think as the benefits of that start to play out longer term, and even with the pressures of quarantine or sheltering in place removed, I think businesses are going to look and say, hey, actually, that wasn't all bad. There's a lot of power there. We've got to keep doubling down on that, because we can get more efficient and more agile and do things better as a company if we think through those experiences and keep indexing in that direction. Outside of that, again, I think we've kind of touched on some of the areas. The notion of sort of big data analytics, I think, is going to be there. And how do you marry all this information that you've got in your organization to make your products, your services, your internal operations better and more efficient? How do you get more predictive with that? Again, to kind of look further ahead of the curve so that you're not always in reactive mode. I think that's going to continue to be a big theme. And then lastly, again, I think
I'm sorry, Chad, to interrupt you on that.
Yeah.
On that specific one, do you have a cadence of any sort at PagerDuty? It's something that I've heard from other folks as well, where once a quarter they dump all their tickets, they look at all their data, and they spend a week just analyzing. Do you do something like that, or is it just a sort of more regular process that you follow?
Yeah, I think we're still evolving into our regular cadence. Again, the sort of the macro level, we do regular sort of data summits cross-functionally within the organization to keep talking through what are the analytics and the data needs that all of our different functions have. How do we keep mapping that back to our data strategy and ensuring that we're trying to, again, stay ahead of the curve on just delivering some of those solutions. And in our particular space, that's more and more focused on AI, ML type solutions to not just do historical, after the fact analysis, but really putting in place mechanisms to look forward and look at things like, propensity for growth or churn or other risks to the organization, and start modeling that in a way that gives us insights faster than our competitors. I think that is going to continue to be a theme. We're already on kind of an annual to quarterly basis with that. I think the pace of that is only going to continue to accelerate.
Makes sense. And sorry, you had one more trend, and I interrupted you because I wanted to get that question in.
Yeah. No, and the last trend, again, I think we've touched on it, is really the notion of the API ecosystem. Continuing to find ways to take those building blocks or those Lego pieces that SaaS and software now provide, and finding a way to glue those together to create new experiences that really map exactly to what your business is doing. Again, even looking at the Slack Salesforce example you put up earlier, years ago, an acquisition like that would have been, okay, well, you've got your data centers and we've got our data centers, and we've got to figure out a way to even have the apps talk to each other. And then how do we integrate the code? But like just a merger or an acquisition, the nature of that 10, 15 years ago was much different than it is today, with the power of APIs that both Salesforce and Slack already have and are only going to continue to improve. There's a lot more power in the hands of the individual, IT admin, developer, engineer, to start creating custom experiences that even go above and beyond what the developers sort of officially offer in their product. Once you start to understand how the APIs expose that functionality, you can really start to dial in the exact experience that your users are looking for. Again, whether that's officially sort of supported out of the box or not. And I think that, again, is a trend that's going to continue as more and more point solutions and really powerful tools come up. It's how do you weave those seamlessly into that experience so that your users get the power and the benefit of all that functionality without the complexity and sort of the old silos that would be created in the past. No,
that totally makes sense. So we have around 10 minutes left, and we've got a bunch of questions. So first of all, again, thank you so much for going through all those topics. In terms of Q&A, I'm going to bucket it into 2 or 3 categories. The first is just actually very specific for at PagerDuty. How do you set your own goals and your team's goals? Like what do you measure your team against at PagerDuty?
Yeah, and so again, that starts first and foremost with our company planning and our company objectives, and so we start with those as our top line measure of, what is it we need to accomplish. And then each of my teams sort of looks through, okay, if we've got a goal of, X percentage growth or X percentage expansion in certain areas, how do we really facilitate that? And again, more and more of our metrics are less, call it the financially driven or the old hard and fast metrics of did you do it on time and on budget, and much more about, okay, if this is where the business is going and these are the sort of objectives that individual departments have, what role do we play in making sure that they're going to be successful at that? And how do we, again, keep delivering the sort of the seamless experience and the solutions that are going to make other teams successful at that? And, some of those are very focused conversations and plans with specific groups and departments because they may have very specific, call it acute needs that have to be met to hit those objectives. But we always try to take that step back and say, hey, what is the lowest common denominator or the thread or the themes that are going through all of these, that if we find solutions, approaches, ways to solve those problems for one team, we actually kind of lift everybody's boat in that tide and everybody benefits from some of those enhancements. And so it really comes down to understanding, again, the strategy and the objectives of the business, and then looking for, okay, how do we enable that? Is that, purely a financial metric we're trying to hit, or is it more experiential? And how do we measure that? And what are the KPIs, say, in our sales process that we're looking at to make our sales folks more efficient? How do we cut time down, in the quoting process to make that more efficient or more seamless? How do we give them more flexibility to do deals that are quicker and more standard without always having to go to security or legal for review? And so we're always kind of questioning what our current approach is versus where we want to be, and figuring out what are those solutions we can implement to get us there faster.
That totally makes sense. Essentially tie everything back to the company goals and then measure yourself against that. The next set of questions, and there are a few of them around this same topic, is recruiting. How do you recruit folks for IT? Where do you go to? How do you find folks? And what do you look for in IT colleagues that you hire at PagerDuty, that you did at Twilio, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, leveraging the power of your team's networks is top of mind. I when I'm looking for a role or trying to find somebody, I think the first place I start with is like, hey, do I know anyone that I've worked with in the past that's done this? I think starting with that familiarity and leveraging those existing relationships is a great untapped potential in a lot of cases. I don't think a lot of companies do enough to mine their own employees for connections and people that have already done some of this at a different company and probably seen it 6 different ways. I think that's a better starting point than, just getting a cold resume in from a recruiter. But again, I'll tie some of this back to this, sort of shift to remote work and work from home. In the past, even if we were tapping our networks and trying to find folks, we were generally focused in, the overall geographic regions of where we typically had an office. So Bay Area, Canada, Atlanta, like wherever those hubs were, we kind of started with our focus there. But that automatically limits, your pool of potential candidates down to, like 2% of the population. And now that we've taken a much more location agnostic approach, I think that's actually opened a lot of floodgates of, hey, if we need a phenomenal database administrator or a data engineer or an analyst, they don't have to be near one of 3 metro regions anymore. They can be anywhere in the world. And as long as they can get their job done effectively, why should we care where they're physically at? I mean, obviously there's aspects of team building and socialization you need to incorporate, but I think we've actually dramatically expanded our opportunity and talent pool, because realistically, we can hire anywhere at any time now. And I think that brings a lot more capability, a lot more interesting, sort of folks to the table to potentially be part of your organization and part of that building those solutions.
No, that totally makes sense. And I'm in complete agreement with you, where I think we're going to enter this sort of heyday of recruiting where, you just have access to such great talent across the world. What are the skills that you're evaluating for your IT colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, a lot of it starts to come down to you less maybe tool specific experience. In the past, it's like, oh, we're an Oracle shop, I need an Oracle DBA, or, oh, we use, Microsoft, and so I need a Windows admin or whatever. I think we've started to abstract some of the tool specific knowledge to, again, like, who are those folks that have built really great experiences? And it's less about sort of an individual tool, and it's more about understanding where the user's coming from and what the business is trying to do, and someone who's maybe a little bit more of a free thinker and can say, okay, I could take this piece of that tool, marry it to this piece of that tool, dump everything here, and create a sort of unified user experience on top of that that automates that process or lets the user do things in 1/10 the time it used to take. They don't need to know all the underlying details. It's those are the kind of skills that I think we're indexing more towards going forward. Like, how do we start to glue all this stuff together? And so the skill sets again are focused more on engineering, people who understand APIs and can pull all these different facets of data and functionality from different tools into that new experience that wasn't there before.
No, that makes sense. Last two questions, and that's all we have time for. If you could go back across your career, what would you have done differently? And mapping that forward to a very specific question, what skills and experiences will be important for the next generation of IT leaders? Like, what should folks start, like folks that are earlier in their career, what should they be thinking about learning right now?
Yeah, those are really good questions. In terms of my own journey, I would say, I always wish that I'd probably taken more risks than I had in the past. I probably had a bit too much of a conservative approach when I was starting my career, and I wanted to make sure that I was going to be in a safe career and a safe job, and sort of that leads you to making decisions that are maybe more middle of the road. And I think I probably could have started pushing that risk tolerance envelope a little bit earlier on. Now that I've had the benefit of a little bit of maturity and time in my role, I think I'm more open to that. I wish I'd probably actually started that sooner in my journey, because I think I probably would have made some different decisions and maybe could have come up with some cool things that I never even thought of. But I was always focused on, well, I know I could do this, but let's settle for 50% of that and play it safe. And so I think being more open to risk taking earlier would have been good. And in terms of what other folks can think of in their own career, I think that's an aspect of it. Obviously everyone needs to make decisions that are right for them, but I think there's more license and opportunity to experiment and try things and fail in a safe way today than there ever was in the past. And so I think making sure that you're taking advantage of that freedom and that leeway to push the envelope a little bit and maybe push your team, your leadership, your company a little outside their comfort zone. You don't want to do that obviously in a disastrous sort of career ending way, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to question the status quo and come up with experiments and things that are low risk but potentially really high reward, and keep pushing those. A small innovative idea or change can have massive downstream impacts. And so being more vocal about those opportunities or calling those out in your organization, whatever that role might be, I think is super valuable. And I think companies are more open to that today. So take advantage of that from a cultural standpoint.
I love it. If I could synthesize all of your this entire conversation into a few nuggets, it is align yourself with the company goals and take risks. Seem to be the sort of the combo of the two, right? Like, and that's how you're guiding towards the right direction. Chad, I could not be more appreciative of you spending this time, and also obviously for being an atSpoke customer. So thank you so much. For the folks listening in, thank you so much. We'll be sharing a recording of this by email as well. Chad, I appreciate the thank you again.